Well, howdy, y'all. This is the Losman here, and it's Sunday, so that means it's another lazy Sunday roundup. All right, so now we are 25 days away from Halloween, and that means that we're going to be getting closer to candy and costumes and parties and all sorts of fun stuff. I mean, it's one of the best times of the year, along with Christmas and tax day. Gotta have things to look forward to, of course. Well, that being said, this past week I did a little bit of movie watching and working on a lot of lists and some interesting news, which I will bring up. But first, I will talk about some of the movies that came out. We have Twins of Evil. Now, Twins of Evil is a Hammer production that I watched because I did a list on vampires and horror movies. And basically, Twins of Evil is exactly what it sounds like. You've got twins that are evil. Now, seriously, it's a period piece about a small town in Europe that is basically being kind of led by an angry mob of uber religious folk who burn witches. So what ends up happening is a vampire settles into the village and decides to shake things up a bit. It's a Hammer movie, which means it's going to be mild on the nudity, kind of bloody in a PG way, PG-13 way, but interesting. I mean, these movies are well made. I mean, they're great movies. They represent a different time period, though. I mean, even though this movie came out in the 1970s, it clearly reflects the era of the 1960s, and it does have Peter Cushing in it, so that's a pretty cool, thing to check out there. Another movie I checked out was The Vampire Circus. Now, this one's not as well known. It's also a Hammer movie. It has a town that's basically kind of been cordoned off because of a plague, and this mysterious circus shows up, and the circus has some interesting characters in there. Now, it's an interesting movie to check out. Like I said, it's a Hammer movie, so, it's got the usual Hammer things in it. You've got very beautiful ladies, you've got really good, interesting sets, and good music, and you don't have the super gore that you would see because this was the early 70s, of course, and but they're still fun. I mean, this represents a different era of filmmaking, especially with horror movies. This is before the era of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the slasher. So this is when you still had some of those gothic themes to horror that, going back to the 1930s, the Universal monsters. Another movie I watched, not quite horror, but it's one I finally got around to watching, was Avengers Endgame. Yes, finally, after what? Like 10, 11, 12 years since the first Marvel movie was released. It's been a long journey. It's been a good journey. I mean, this, quite honestly, is, I mean, how many movies were there? Were like, oh God, like 20 movies or something with, all the sequels and follow-up films and tie-ins and whatnot. And I can truthfully say that the Marvel films as a series are all outstanding. I mean, even the weakest Marvel movie is better than most of the DC offerings. What can the DC universe say against Marvel? Wonder Woman and Aquaman, and that's it. I mean, those are the only really two well-made, DC movies. And whereas Marvel, holy crap, they got a whole universe of great movies, and you can go back and rewatch them over and over. They're so awesome. They're so great. And Endgame really capped things up and made it interesting. It was fun. It was entertaining. This is something that the very first movie came out when I started seeing my girlfriend, so it was kind of something that we bonded over because, even though we don't read comic books, we love the comic book movies. We both, we watched virtually all the movies together and made sure to, not spoil them too much. So, we always made sure to, sit up, watch them together so that way we can be ready for the next film. Okay, and the last movie that I watched this week, I watched it earlier today, was Darkness Falls. Now, Darkness Falls came out over 10 years ago, and it doesn't have a very high score on the on the tomato meter. It's an okay score on the IMDb. It's a horror movie, PG-13, which means it's not too bloody. It's a little scary. It deals with a killer tooth fairy, of all things. I think I actually had this movie on a list of absurd horror movie villains, but that's the thing about these movies. You can come up with an interesting premise and work with it, and Darkness Falls has got some things going for it. It's the scene in the lighthouse is pretty awesome, and it's got a decent cast. I think I saw Emily Browning in the beginning of the movie, and then the rest of the movie I didn't really recognize anyone. But you know, that's the thing about a lot of these movies. You know, they came out, you know, and they maybe made a splash, maybe didn't. This one wasn't too bad. I mean, it's not as bad as some of the other movies I've seen, and but it certainly isn't one of the greatest ones. So, you know, like I said, it was available on Amazon Prime. It was for free. I put it on, kind of, well, just enjoyed it, you know, as best I could. But you know, it was a horror movie, you know, and it's October, so you gotta keep watching. All right, so well, we got some interesting news here. Actually, this is actually some fun news to look forward to. Last week I talked about a friend of mine named La Bellana Winters. She was going to do a podcast appearance on a podcast in her area. Kind of an odd circumstance. They lost most of her interview, and what they did have was done over the telephone. Although it was kind of interesting. They talked about ghostly encounters and things like that. And thing is, I've known La Bellana for about 5 or 6 months now. And this was like the first time I'd ever heard these stories. So it was pretty interesting. I mean, you know, she's a good friend of mine now. But it's fun finding out these stories, you know. And that being said, we had a fun discussion afterwards. And she suggested that we should do a podcast together. And I'm like, wow, that would be a great idea. So sometime next year, we will do a podcast. Me being in South Texas, her being in North Texas. So it'll be great. You know, we'll talk about movies. We'll talk about, you know, scary things, bizarre happenings, you know, odd little things going on in our area. But it's going to be something fun and interesting. You know, maybe we'll do some interviews and get some tie-ins with some local vendors and whatnot. One of the things that we both enjoy doing is going to comic or horror movie conventions, or conventions in general. I know she told me she loves checking out the vendors. I, on the other hand, you know, like to meet the celebrities. But it would be one of those great things that if we could team up, we can put together a pretty fun little podcast. And that's gonna be something I'm gonna be looking forward to. So I'll give you more details next year on that. But it's gonna be something fun and interesting, you know, because you know what I like. You know, it's great to get a little more exposure out there, and I'm still gonna do these fun little videos and. Eventually get around to doing another movie for, you know, hardcore interview. Soon. All right, so next thing on the order is we had a movie release over the weekend, The Joker. I didn't get a chance to go check it out because I was doing a lot of Lyft driving this week, but I did have some people tell me about it, that they really enjoyed it, and it was a really dark movie, which I do enjoy. You know, I enjoy black comedies. I enjoy movies that are like kind of got that dark edge to them. And, you know, even though I'm not a big comic book reader, I do know that the Joker is a very dark, complex character, you know, especially as personified by Jared Leto or, you know, Heath Ledger. Now, I mean, Jack Nicholson played a decent one. He's a little more comical. And, of course, Cesar Romero, I mean, the guy was just a complete nut job. He was hilarious in that role, but that was a different type of Batman. This one is done by Joaquin Phoenix, and Joaquin Phoenix has had a very interesting career. He plays very challenged individuals. You know, this is not a guy who does simple roles. I mean, he's, you know, when you give him a script, you know, the first thing you're going to want to know is this guy weird? Is he bizarre? Is he strange? Is he like out there? One that I'm in. I mean, that's basically his criteria. It has to be something a little out of the ordinary for him to tackle, because, you know, he's not your typical leading man. I mean, he's the complex hero or the you know, sadistic villain that you secretly sympathize for. So I'm gonna probably check that out this week, especially with you know, Halloween coming up. There's gonna be some interesting movies to check out, especially some classics. Speaking of movies, let's see what we have. Oh, this is a good one. I got me a nice steelbook of The Terrifier. Now, Terrifier is one of my favorite movies of the past, you know, well, past 2 years, I guess. And it's basically emerged as one of my favorite movies of the past decade. I think it's it's definitely one of the sickest and grossest movies. I mean, Art the Clown is just an amazing villain, especially portrayed by David Howard Thornton, who I met last year at this time. I mean, the guy was just brilliant in the role. If you look in the back, it's got the girl hanging upside down, and strangely enough, they've got a little bit of red covering her naked parts, so kind of, no, still not safe for work, but still, you know, right here, steelbook for Terrifier. Now, I am aware that they made a VHS copy as well. kind of odd how VHS is suddenly catching on, kind of like vinyl records. I mean, it's like, gee, are we having a full throwback to the 1980s? Next thing you know, they're going to want to start bringing back cassette players and parachute pants. Oof, God, what were we thinking back then? But they had great movies. Seriously, great movies. I will never knock the 80s for movies or music because it was awesome. Not so much the fashion, though. All right, so now this week I did a few more lists, as you know I've been doing for the past 2 months, 3 months. Been doing quite a number of lists. Now the lists I'm doing as we get closer to Halloween are going to get a little more interesting, as you know, since I want to come up with ideas for lists that are going to be really interesting that you can share with others, and that's really want to do with these. Is I want people to be able to go out and read them and enjoy them and share them, because it's what I love to do. I love to tell people about scary movies or horror movies or just general movies in general that they might like. A lot of times people go into the horror movie scene. They go rent movies. They typically rent your Chuckies or your Jasons or your Michael Myers, and they don't realize that there's a whole universe of horror films out there that don't involve Freddy, Jason, or Michael. You have all sorts of great movies out there, and that's one of my aims, is to get people to watch them, go out and seek them out. Go out and look for older movies too. Like last week I watched Spider Baby, which was amazing. It's a little different, but it was a great movie for its era because it was so weird and so different. But damn, it's you see Sid Haig in one of his first roles. You see Lon Chaney Jr. in one of his last roles. I mean, that's like, what, 70 years of acting greatness. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through some of the movies that I listed on one of my lists. So one of the lists I did was dealing with vampire movies. Now, in the 1970s, you had a fair number of vampire movies that came out. I don't know, for some reason, vampires became really in vogue. Mainly in the in the 60s they became popular, especially with Christopher Lee, portrayal with the Hammer movies, like I mentioned earlier. And you also had some more vampire roles come out. So of course you have Taste the Blood of Dracula, which was a major Christopher Lee movie that came out in 1970. You had The Vampire Lovers. Now, here's an interesting little fun era, or little strange event of that era. At the time, the gay community was fighting to get its way out of the closet, and you didn't really see gay characters out in the open, except when they were lesbian women, and if they were vampires. For some strange reason, vampire lesbians became a genre that was okay, I guess. I mean, people kind of thought that was like, I'm okay with that, gee, I wonder why. So Vampire Lovers was one of the first movies that represented the genre in the 1970s. I believe it had Ingrid Pitt in it, and it Madeline Smith, I believe, or was it Matt something Smith? But yeah, it's these movies were basically a little more than what your typical Hammer movie offered. There was a lot more nudity in them, and a lot of suggestive scenes involving sex, and playing off the more romantic aspects of the Dracula story, especially with extremely beautiful women. So yeah, you saw a couple of movies like that, which reminds me of another movie that came out in the same era, that was Daughters of Darkness. Now, the first time I ever watched Daughters of Darkness was last year during Joe Bob's movie marathon, and that one was another movie that it represents. You have a young married couple basically going to a remote beach resort in an off season, and they encounter this enchanting lady, kind of this countess, who kind of seduces both of them. And thing is, she's got a secret, and that secret is she's a vampire. So a lot of action in that movie too. It's a very interesting movie. It's very erotic. I mean, a lot of these movies are really erotic. Now you had another movie here, Let's Scare Jessica to Death. Now, this particular movie was a little different for a vampire movie. It deals with a woman who recently came out of a mental institution, having to adjust to a new life. She goes back home, helps run a farm, but she's getting these visions, and she's strangely drawn to this woman, who comes out of the water, and it's a very, I mean, it's a really trippy movie. I would venture to say that this is one of the best movies of the 1970s, and it's one of the ones that a lot of people don't really mention a lot. Especially when you talk about the 1970s horror scene. You have Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you have Jaws, you have Alien, you have Suspiria. You have these movies that are just grand. I mean, The Omen. You've got The Exorcist. These are movies that are among the best ever made, and yet Let's Scare Jessica to Death should be included in that conversation, because it really is. I mean, it's an atmospheric film. It's very kind of trippy. It's like almost like a mist-filled movie without the mist. It's got that kind of imagery. It's a very interesting movie. If you get a chance to check it out, I really highly recommend it. It's one of the best movies of the early 1970s. Now, you also have a movie called The House That Dripped Blood. Now, this one was a anthology film, and like with a lot of anthology films, it basically presents a couple of stories, mild horror stories, not too scary. Most of them based on stories by like Edgar Allan Poe and other horror movie writers. Then you have Twins of Evil, which I mentioned earlier. It was an interesting movie, So, yeah, okay. Now, here's a fun one. Another real popular genre of the early 1970s was the blaxploitation movement. This is where you had a lot of movies being made with black, characters that stood out as the hero. Well, one of the most famous ones was Blackula, starring, what was his name? William Marshall. Yeah, William Marshall. Blackula is an interesting movie. It is a blaxploitation movie, but it's definitely doesn't fit the pattern. I mean, it's actually a fun movie. It's, a little scary, but it's the portrayal of Blackula that William Marshall's, he carries the film so well. It's a great period piece. I mean, you look at the 1970s, that scene, the disco music and the pimps and the hookers, that culture, and yet you have this elegant gentleman vampire emerge, looking to make a name for himself and to reclaim his lost bride as he thinks he sees her. So I definitely highly recommend Blackula. It sounds silly, but no, it's a great movie. It's definitely one of the best vampire movies of that era. Let's see, another movie. Now here's an interesting one. If you're a fan of the X-Files, you should check out a TV show called The Night Stalker, or Kolchak the Night Stalker. Now, that was a TV series, short-lived series, that was inspired by a TV movie called The Night Stalker. Well, yeah. And what the show was about was you had this reporter by the name of Kolchak. He was always looking into the strange, bizarre stories, and he was one of those guys, kind of like a Fox Mulder. In many respects, I would think of him as Fox Mulder's spiritual father, because he was always out there looking for that bizarre, strange story. And the TV show did have some interesting episodes. It was a short-lived series, but it stood out enough that people, still talk about it to this day. And it's, yeah, the TV movie that started it all is a pretty decent movie. It's worth seeking out. Let's see. Going through my list here, looking for something interesting. Okay, now here's one that's interesting. Martin. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about Martin. It's a George Romero movie about a young man who fancies himself a vampire. So what he does is he basically, I believe he drugs women and, drinks their blood. Now, I know I got into a discussion a while back on another forum about whether he really was a vampire or not. And the conclusion was, you know what? Watch the movie and find out for yourself. It's a really interesting movie. As vampire movies go, it's not your typical, caped, creature of the night. This one's a little different. It's not your conventional vampire movie, but it's definitely an important film in the 1970s. Definitely want to check out. Now, another movie I would recommend, and this one has a special place in my heart. That's Dracula from 1979, starring Frank Langella. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because this was the very first iteration of Dracula that I had ever seen. Iteration, is that the right word? Portrayal. Oh. So, yeah, this one starred Frank Langella and John Gielgud. And it generally fits the Bram Stoker story. Yeah, there's some slight changes in the characters, character names. I know, because like I wondered when I watched the one by Martin Scorsese, like, did they name the people right? But no, it's great. I mean, Frank Langella played an excellent Count Dracula, and the movie itself, you know, even though it came from the 70s, yeah, it represented some of the best of the 1970s. I mean, it's very, very atmospheric. There's, you know, small, you know, there's a fair amount of blood, you know, it's got the repressed sexual energy that you would expect in a Dracula story that was made recently. And great portrayals. I mean, I was about 8 or 9 years old when I watched it, and it spooked me something silly, but I enjoyed it so much. And to me, and even though I've seen so many other vampire movies, Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee and Gary Oldman, I still like Frank Langella, and I still think he's one of the best out there. So, I mean, if you ever get a chance to watch Dracula with Frank Langella, check it out. It is, I mean, it's a great movie. I mean, it's definitely worth checking out. Now, that same year, 1979, another vampire movie came out. Only this one was a little more lighthearted. This was Love at First Bite with George Hamilton playing Count Dracula. This one was a horror comedy, and this was probably one of the very first horror comedies I ever saw. The movie is just silly. It's a little, you know, I mean, it's Dracula, but it's told in the modern era. I believe he's pursuing this woman played by, I believe, Susan St. James, and the Von Helsing character is played by Richard Benjamin, and they have some truly funny moments in that movie. So, yeah, it's a little crazy and a little silly, but it's fun. Then you have Nosferatu the Vampire. This also came out in 1979, starring Klaus Kinski, directed by Werner Herzog. This is a remake of the classic movie from the 1920s. With in color, more blood, you know, a little more, you know, spookiness to it, and it's a classic. It's, you know, it's one of those cult classics that people seek out, and it's definitely one you want to catch if you're into vampire movies. See, and the last movie I'm going to talk about is Salem's Lot, which is a miniseries of Stephen King. I believe it stars David Soul, and it focuses on vampires, you know. So you've got it's, you know, I mean, it's, you know, Salem's Lot. It's one of his first movies, so yeah, definitely check that out. I know I've only seen bits and pieces of it. I really have not sat and watched the whole thing, even though I really should. It's just I've never gotten around to checking it out. But now another list I did was involving involving westerns, but I could probably discuss that next week, because you know, this is really getting past the 20-minute mark, and it's about time to call it quits, so that way I can go back to enjoying some movies and putting together some other lists. All right, so like I said, it's 25 days to Halloween. It's almost time, so let's get your candy ready, get your costume ready, you know, check out those parties, get your movies, you know, set up, you know, check out some haunted houses. You know, I'm gonna enjoy the fine cosplay going on at my local pub, especially because, oh my god, what is it with Halloween and women dressing sexy? Oh my. So I'm gonna go and call it quits. This is Losman. All right, see ya.